Hello, everyone. My name is Lynn McEntee, and I'm hosting Spotlight on Youth, and we're from Youth for Change Canada. I'm very excited to host some wonderful guests today, and we're going to be talking about domestic violence and family dynamics. I have Jensen Williams and also Shane Smith, who is from Spacious Minds. I'll introduce them with their bios in a moment, but I wanted to just remind everyone about Youth for Change. We're all about shining light on the youth of today and stepping outside the box and making change, creating opportunities for youth to find their way in the community and engage themselves in community and civic engagement. So step outside the box, and if you have an idea for a show, please message us at lynn@youthforchange.ca, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about any upcoming shows or ideas that you may have, or a youth that's making change in your community, in our community. Please let me know. I'd love to shine light on them as well. So today I'm here to shine light on the work that Jensen Williams does, and Jensen Williams is from Guelph, Wellington Women in Crisis, and she's a public educator. And I'd love to read her bio just for a moment to set the tone of the type of work that she's doing. Jensen's work as a public educator for Guelph, Wellington Women in Crisis focuses on violence prevention and empowering community members to become active allies in preventing and ending gender-based violence. She is a proud feminist committed to utilizing education as a tool to achieve justice and equality for all. Welcome, Jensen Williams. And I'm going to go ahead and
Thank you so much for having me, Lynn.
Thank you. It's great to have you. I'm going to go ahead and read the bio for Shane so we can kind of settle into the conversation with both of you, and our viewers have an idea of who's with me today. So I have Shane Smith, and Shane Smith is a qualified psychotherapist and youth and community worker from Ireland, and now works as a psychotherapist with 3 other therapists at Spacious Minds in Guelph, which is a therapy he founded 3 years ago. And today Shane is going to be here talking about family dynamics with us. So welcome, Shane.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you. And it's great. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I thought I'd start out with Jensen, if you don't mind, just raising the conversation. And Jensen, I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about, and tell our viewers and listeners about defining what and understanding domestic violence, what that is. We hear those buzzwords a lot, and the importance of those words. I wondered if you could help us out there at the start of the program.
Sure, Lynn. So domestic violence is violence that happens between people who have an intimate relationship. So it's not just romantic partners, but can happen amongst family members. And these can be in current or former relationships. It can also be referred to as intimate partner violence, dating violence, or woman abuse. And it's really about utilizing power and control through physical violence. So using physical force as a form of violence, utilizing sexual violence, so coercing dating partners to engage in or forcing people to engage in sexual activities without their consent, emotional and psychological abuse, which really kind of touches on that, like intimidation, control, and then sometimes we see financial abuse as well, so controlling or compromising someone's access to financial resources. But ultimately, as I said, we see this as being a way to exert power and control over a partner, over a family member, and it might be meant to scare, intimidate, or humiliate, and to make a person feel powerless. And that isolation factor as well. So the power and control can be exerted to isolate people from their friends and their family. And we also see this as being part of gender-based violence. So when I say that, I mean it's violence enacted against people of particular genders. And so more often than not, we see violence against women being enacted by men, also more often by men who are known to them. So that's that kind of domestic intimate partner aspect to that. And it's not to say it doesn't happen to men. It most certainly does, but more often than not, women are overrepresented as experiencing domestic violence. And maybe Shane can talk more about how this kind of impacts families and children. To take the lead.
Thank you, Jensen.
Yeah, I guess in my kind of sense of working as a psychotherapist with families and with couples, the subtle ways in which it can exist. I know, Jensen, you mentioned kind of the very obvious ways, I guess, that we associate domestic violence. When we hear that word, we might think of like big behaviors or physical violence, but like you touched on the idea of power and control and how psychological and control around finances, or control around like what somebody should or shouldn't say to somebody else. There's so many subtle ways in which it can happen. I guess in the therapy center where I work, it tends to be the many microaggressions that build up to being like creating a violent relationship between people. So yeah, and it can just like really the depths of it can be quite uh, you can go quite deep really, because it can be intergenerational. It can have, one person could have seen their parents behaving in this particular manner and thought this is how parents and this is how adults behave with each other, and then reenact that violence or that behavior with somebody else again. And the complexity of it, I guess, trying to work with it therapeutically, to try and enact some kinds of change and educate people around it, it really is quite a big task to take on, I think. And like agencies like Women in Crisis Center, um, the work that they do is so like fantastic and so necessary, and Youth for Change, like all these organizations working together hand in hand. I think it's the complexity of it, I guess, is what I'm getting at, is so broad that society needs to all work together towards making changes in it. I don't think there's any one solution to it.
Oh, that's well said. Yeah. Jensen, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you touched upon kind of those community solutions and that holistic approach of everyone working together, because I think that's really when we'll see the change, is when we see everyone as being actively involved in this work to end violence. Because even if we're not experiencing it in our lives, we always can have an example of someone who has said, made it like a joke, or someone who's exerting behaviors. And it's even kind of challenging those behaviors when we see someone belittling women in any way, when we see gender discrimination, when we see things that contribute to that larger problem of gender inequality, that really keeps the cycles of violence going. And I think that you touched upon that pretty well, of how it is a cycle, and even with that pattern of abuse too, that it's rarely just an isolated incident, and normally does kind of speak to a cycle that, like you said, can be intergenerational for sure.
I think the idea that you mentioned there, Jensen, of like uh, challenging even small acts of violence, like the so-called locker room talk of men, that it's like, oh, it's just normal, it's just accepted to belittle women or to joke or to talk about your female partner, in if you're in a hetero relationship, in a negative or demeaning manner. That can be so accepted broadly, so it can be quite a difficult thing, but a very little acts of resistance, and it can be big acts of resistance even to speak against those kinds of violent behaviors, to start to make a change in how humans communicate around this kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's an important point, not to let things go, which can be difficult. And um, I'm not sure whether society is going in a more positive direction or more negative direction. I definitely think like the Me Too movement has made a huge change of giving female people more voice to it. Do you, in your experience, see it kind of going in the right direction, or do you see it going like, do you get more scared or more worried? I'm curious if that's
That's
a
a
fair
really good
question.
question. That's a great question, Shane. Yeah.
I think with any movement, you see victories and you see setbacks all the time. And I think, it's really about looking at where we've come. So we're nearing up to like International Women's Day on March 8th. And I think that's always a great opportunity to sort of reflect where the women's movement and the movement against gender-based violence has come. And, seeing that it continues to gain more and more social support. We've gone from like feminists are angry, women don't have as many rights, and now we're seeing it become more intersectional. So thinking about issues that aren't just about gender, but also about sexuality and gender identity, about class, about Indigenous identities, racialized identities. So I see that movement becoming stronger, of needing to kind of look at the social roots that perpetuate gender-based violence. So income inequality, we've seen that be a big conversation around the pandemic, especially. We've seen kind of the movement propel forward to address the issues that aren't just looking at it as what's the word I'm looking for, like one-sided, or not multidimensional. And so I think that it has made progress. And I think that actually youth have been a major reason why that progress has been so positive, and why there's so many empowered young people who are leading this movement, and not just women, but seeing men and gender non-conforming folks. I think that's a huge thing that will push this movement forward, is the involvement of men and boys seeing themselves in this work as well. So it was a bit of a long-winded answer, but
Oh, that was an awesome answer.
Good answer, yeah.
For both of you. Nice, very connected. Thank you so much. Is there something you want to say, Shane, to that? Or
No, yeah, I definitely like the idea of the intersectionality around violence is just so important as well. Of course, it's not just addressing the violence, it's addressing like all the other layers of um, inequality and divisions of power that are and access to services and resources that like perpetuate the cycle of violence further, as Jensen was saying. I really like the positivity of acknowledging the work that younger people are doing in terms of breaking down stereotypes and structural norms, and the accessibility to like non-binary and queer folk to be joining in communities of consolidation towards change is really definitely a victory and a positive feeling in my mind. So I think most of the time I'm more positive about the future.
oh, that's encouraging. If you're looking at changing the impacts of violence, then sort of as we move forward in society, making change with youth and outside the box, and all of us in our layers of society, what are some of the impacts that we could discuss here as far as in making change?
Hey, oh, did you want to go, Jensen, or you want to go?
you go ahead.
Cool. I guess for me, and I think Jensen, you mentioned the idea of trauma. Many studies show the impact that trauma has on people, particularly when in their developmental stages of life. So if that trauma isn't treated or worked with or provided with safety and security, then all kinds of needs to act out in violent or aggressive manners can come from that place. So I think definitely working with people who are struggling with traumatic events in their life from childhood, providing them either with therapy or support groups or youth groups that all like are trauma informed in the way that they work with the people that they serve, providing a safe space to navigate through that so that there can be resilience and growth from the trauma rather than a need to come from a protected, violent or defended position. Not saying that trauma is the source of all violence, but there's a connection there in many cases of like, yeah, things weren't great. And trauma obviously coming from many different aspects like racialized trauma or gender-based violence. And yeah, I guess also the idea of continuing to educate the people who are the perpetrators of violence and working with them, and which can be a very challenging thing for many people. And like as a therapist, working with people who have been violent or continue to be violent is a challenging position to be in, and I have to really like get a lot of supervision and support when working with people like that. But I do believe that change is possible when education and supports and a curiosity rather than a judgmental approach. And again, that can sound apologist, but definitely not being apologist, but being firm and brave to have these kind of conversations, because often the perpetrators are not happy. It doesn't work for them. There's like a real most of the time, like there isn't happiness. Happy people don't tend to need to hurt other people. So yeah, I think there's again back to the idea of like a multi-pronged approach needed. I guess working as much as we can to prevent it, and then working to treat it when it does exist, and then to change it for the future.
Thank you. Jensen, anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say is necessary too, is that approach from service providers. So Shane, you mentioned being trauma informed, and I would also add to that to be like survivor centered. So for service providers such as counselors, such as healthcare professionals, really seeing survivors as like the expert of their own experiences, knowing what they need best, and really letting them kind of direct the process of what they'd like to see. It can be really tempting, even as individuals, to want to give advice about what folks should do and how folks should behave. But I think really just recognizing that survivors are the experts of their own lives and know best what they need, and really centering them and having services that walk alongside them and empower them in their journey to healing. And then from that individual change approach. I think with youth, you mentioned education, Shane, and I think you don't necessarily have to be an educator who's trained to do that work. Because I think it really, from educators, from myself, from people within the school systems, making conversations about healthy relationships and consent part of that curriculum that's taught, but also from youth learning from one another and normalizing having those conversations about healthy relationships and consent and boundaries. Um, and so I think the availability of programming and the availability from youth to learn from one another is something that would be really powerful in making that change. And youth really learn a lot from one another and see them like role models in adults, but also from each other. And kind of as I touched on before, making a stance when you hear something that is a negative comment about women and being vocal about that. That's stuff that is really important and can go a long way in kind of correcting those behaviors and making a different standard of what it means to be a respectful person.
Oh, that's incredible. No, coming from the education field as well too, I totally get it. And we were having a conversation just the other day about mental health and well-being, and when does that begin? And so education in this regard, does that begin from birth? Should that begin in preschool? Should it be from the beginning of life? All of our programming that we do, is that what we're speaking to here? That would be a great resource. And in the end, as a society, we would be so much more rich to have that early on in our education field. Yeah.
And I think it can start at any time too. Like it depends on the way you talk about it and it being age appropriate. So with kids, talking about consent and even that they have the right over their own bodies, that if someone says, "Can I give you a hug?" that they can say no. Or, if someone's tickling them and they don't like it, that they can say no. So I think it is really starting those lessons young and just talking about it in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Shane?
Yeah, I think that's an awesome change in comparison to when I was growing up, I guess. And like you were just told to be quiet and accept what's going on. And men or boys have to be a particular way, and girls or women have to be a particular way. And it was all very structured. And so to see it kind of changing and definitely gives me hope to see the language of consent and ownership of your own body and being able to set clear boundaries from a very early age to be so positive. I see my nephew and he's just so like aware of what he wants and doesn't want and what works for him. And he's so well able to communicate it to me. I'm like going, wow, like I did not have that well until my 20s or later did I have that level of kind of knowledge that this like 7-year-old boy has now, which is so great. And I
That's
really
awesome.
liked what you, yeah, it's great. I really liked what you said, Jensen, about the idea of survivor centered, because again, kind of maybe showing my age a little, but some of the training that I got, like, wouldn't necessarily have been using that language of survivor centered or trauma informed, and there might have been the element of like the professional as expert or therapists or psychologists or psychiatrists or doctors or agencies, like knowing what's best and using interventions informed from that approach. So to definitely shift around and it is so refreshing to see like that agencies and therapists and psychologists and doctors are starting to shift around, and so many of them are trauma informed and survivor centered, knowing exactly as you said, like that the person is the expert and they have the path and the knowledge towards their own healing and their own recovery and their own freedom within themselves when provided with the right conditions, I guess, from society support as well. So that's an awesome point, I think.
Oh, it's interesting. Working with international students and newcomers and survivors of trauma myself, I know one of the programs I worked with, they actually literally changed their name at the time and sort of changed the literature midstream to something more survivors of trauma as opposed to victims of trauma, torture, and such, right? So it is just positive connotations, I guess, or, rewording of the connotations. Shane, if you have a moment to sort of speak to sort of how what therapy is, if you don't mind, if I'm just going to kind of jump right into that, and how rigid are gendered roles. That was sort of just wanted to start there, and then maybe we can jump in with Jensen thereafter.
Sorry, what type of therapy, Lynn, did you ask
Thank
about?
you. Yeah, what is couples therapy?
Oh yes. Okay, cool. Yeah. Couples therapy, and of course, like there's poly relationships now as well. So it's important to like even changing language to be inclusive of polycules. So which is people who have many other or more than one partner. But couples therapy, I guess, or relationship therapy, it can vary depending on what people are coming in with, looking for support around. One type of therapy that I'm more specifically trained in, I guess it's called emotion focused therapy. And that looks at kind of attachment, longings, or desires. Basically, when we're born, we all need a human because we're born so vulnerable and so little. So we need another human. It's necessary for our survival and safety. And if that other human, it doesn't matter who it is, that other caregiver is kind and caring and responsive, then we develop like this kind of safe view of relationships, and we develop a safe view of ourselves, and we believe the world is safe, and we start to feel safe and secure in ourselves. However, more often than not, there's like stuff that happens, and or not more often than not, but sometimes the attachment bond can be not as strong or solid or secure. And that can be due to financial issues, due to racial issues, due to societal pressures, or intergenerational trauma. Of course, like the residential schools. In Ireland, the Catholic Church didn't do any favors to helping parents parent their children. So certainly not a blame on individuals from my perspective. And so sometimes that attachment bond can get damaged, and people can start to feel insecure or unsafe in themselves and unsafe in relationships. The theory behind emotion focused therapy is that we then carry that into later life. The good news is it can be changed and corrected and adapted depending on who we're with and what the relationship is like in adulthood or throughout our lives. So positive relationships can start to shift that, and we can get a safe view of ourselves and a safe view of the world again, which is really good news. So therapeutically, we work with relationships to identify where it doesn't feel safe, what's causing the unsafety, what's causing the harm. And often it's a power imbalance. It's linked to gender very often. It's linked to finances and securities and again, the intersectionality of stuff in terms of people's lives. And through putting words on it, the focus can shift away from blame to one of understanding and curiosity. And then people can start to, in relationship, if it's a couple, start to see, oh, okay, when my partner gets upset with me about something, it's because they're feeling insecure or unsafe. And I need to figure out how to work with them towards reestablishing safety and harmony in their nervous system so that they feel like they want to connect with me. Very often there's a view of like, oh, my partner is really cranky or angry or has too high standards or causes all the trouble. And there isn't an actual understanding of like, well, what's going on for that person in that moment? Are they scared? And again, not to fall into gender stereotypes, but oftentimes men are cultured not to see what's happening for their partner, not to see that like, oh, maybe they're scared, maybe they're actually like had like a whole different experience as a female, if it's in a heterosexual relationship, as a female embodied person walking around in the world all their lives, and they have a whole different lens, and then they're likely to feel insecure or scared from something completely different than I would or a male would, considering we haven't experienced that kind of level of power imbalance, because males have more power in society. So yeah, couples therapy tries to dig into that, unpack it a little, and create a space that feels safe and secure in a non-judgmental and non-blaming way, because I think like men are screwed over in that dynamic too. Like the man box implies, which is a term that like men have to behave in a particular manner. Like they have to be, the only emotions allowed are angry or happy, pretty much, and that's like how you're allowed to express your range of emotions as a male. Well, from my generation anyway, it's definitely changing. And then women, of course, are packaged into a whole different level of societal norms, and then which together feeds into some unhealthy dynamics sometimes and unfair power imbalances. So couples therapy tries to address all of that in a space that hopefully leads to a positive outcome for people.
Thank you very much.
That answers a little bit of it.
Oh, absolutely. No, for sure. And you referenced the man box. That was my next question. So I appreciate you referencing that.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. That's great. Jen, so did you want to add to anything that Shane was saying? I was going to ask you a question.
I think that I'm really glad to hear that couples therapy does address like that gender imbalance and how that contributes to power dynamics. I know that like I guess I'm wondering for what would like have for people who might not process and deal with, unhealthy masculinity through couples therapy or through other therapy.
Mm.
Like how would you suggest kind of we get that education out there in a more, I guess, accessible and widely available way? So I'm curious to hear
Mm.
what would you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's again something probably we all have to work together towards, because therapy is definitely like uh, inaccessible to many people due to cost issues and stigma people have around therapy. So I think again it's kind of I don't know if there's any short answer to the question, but perhaps like many factors working together towards change, like the communities of anti-oppression around race, communities of anti-oppression around gender identity, and communities of like feminist communities, all inspiring and working together. And um, yeah, like social media, education, all the things you kind of mentioned, I guess, and school, of course, being such an important thing to educate around gender differences. I think one positive thing that I see, and it's more here in Canada than back home in Ireland, although it is starting to happen more in Ireland too, is like the acceptance of non-binary folk and the change of language towards using gender neutral pronouns, like language and the way we think and view about gender, hopefully filtering forwards into future generations, potentially leading to changes to break down so that the power is more divested or shared or less needed to be hoarded and less anxiety and fear for people around needing to hoard the resources. I think, I don't know, Lynn, do you have some? I guess, yeah, the youth, of course, is such a huge factor. Sorry, Lynn.
Oh no, that was awesome. That you guys are fantastic. I love the back and forth. It's great. I was actually going to ask Jensen. Benson, you were speaking. We were sort of talking about resources, I guess, in some ways, paraphrasing there. How do you support Jensen? How do you support someone who's experiencing domestic violence? Just a little sidebar conversation. Yeah.
Sure. So I think that like organizations can play a really big role in that support. So local gender-based violence organizations in the Guelph Wellington community, we have Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis, but there are rape crisis, sexual assault, gender-based violence organizations. Luckily, in like most communities, which is amazing, and that has been, I think, an indication of where we've come as a movement to have that be something that's prioritized to exist in a community. And so those services can provide a multitude of different things depending on where you are. For our center in Guelph Wellington, we offer counseling, we have a sexual assault center helping with address housing, so helping women find both emergency, so we have an emergency shelter, as well as long-term housing. That can be a major barrier to being able to leave, is having access to affordable, safe, independent housing. We also connect people with legal services, so helping to know their rights, a family court support program, which can help out with those services. We serve the rural communities as well, which I think is something that's really important and underrepresented when I'm saying that these services exist in most communities. That is a gap that we see, is it not being as widely available in the rural areas. So I'm happy to say that we are filling that gap with our center. So that's one aspect, is if someone is wanting a more formal, someone say like clinical supports and access to that through a center, through an organization. But there's also an immense and incredibly valuable support that individuals in that person's life can provide. I know I mentioned that isolation is a tactic of abusers to try to separate those being abused from their friends and family that can provide those emotional and tangible supports. But one thing is just responding to when you know someone is going through it, or you suspect that someone is going through it, just to check in with them. And if someone does disclose their experiences with you, that they are in an abusive relationship, that they are experiencing domestic violence, I think there's a few key things that you can play as someone in their lives, mainly being just listening to them, providing a listening ear, and a non-judgmental ear as well. So not asking questions that kind of indicate that they were at fault or they could have prevented what had happened to them. Believing them is a huge thing. Just saying, I believe you. I know that this must be really difficult for you. I'm here if you need anything. Um, Assessing, their immediate safety. So, what do you need to feel safe right now, or do you currently feel safe? Asking those types of questions, and again, as I said, like seeing them as the expert of their own experiences. So, kind of asking questions that, put them in the powerful role of what do you want to do next? So, what have you thought about doing next? Have you thought about staying? Have you thought about leaving? Really kind of leaving that ownership of what to do with them, and then just letting them know that you are available if they need support, that you're someone that they can trust and reach out to. So I think that there's the organizational support through gender-based violence organizations, there's individual supports, and then I guess like in a big picture there's society being supportive, as we're saying, kind of through that education and utilizing education to kind of come away from things like victim blaming and those attitudes that kind of say that women are at fault for the abuse that they experience, and challenging that on a broader level.
Would you say then that has shifted, Shane, as well as Jensen, over the past, say, 10, 20 years of sort of looking the other way, so to speak? Instead of looking the other way, it's someone else's business. People are more cognizant of that and stepping forward and watching red flags.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think there's still more work to be done. Obviously, I think there is still a lot of victim blaming and a lot of denial of how significant violence is against, particularly gender-based violence. But definitely, like, I guess it is I think anyway, from my perspective, there seems to be more awareness and more attention to it. And yeah, I think as Jensen said, the idea of believing somebody is such an important thing, to actually validate somebody's story, somebody's reality, rather than dismissing or questioning or asking how did they get themselves into that position, or instead of like that victim blaming piece can be so common. And gaslighting done on a broad level by society, where in general, like the idea is previously was, yeah, that dressing or behaving or speaking your thoughts or opinions in a particular manner would be, therefore violence was entitled against that behavior or that look or that way of dressing. So I think there's more awareness of like that way of thinking is just so backwards that it's not as acceptable as it was definitely when I was growing up. But still, like, even a court case recently, I think last year or the year before in Ireland, the judge threw a rape case out of court because of what the woman was wearing. So it's like, which sounds archaic and terrible, but it's still there, and like so many women don't report because of the whole structure of reporting violence in terms of the police system and the courts, and the likelihood of it not working. But it is changing, and there is positivity towards in the right direction. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. That's where I guess the idea of education and newer people coming in and younger people coming up and being like, okay, this needs to change. These systems are no longer acceptable for the society we want to create for our children and for their children's children. And so it's like, hopefully, I think through this work and social media and education and outreach and talking about it like you're doing here, Lynn and Jensen, and bring it into the awareness, hopefully there's like room to change, to continue making the world a better place for people.
That's lovely. And for couples, when they come to see you, at what stage of the game are they in, I guess, so to speak? And are they in a violent relationship, or other levels of their relationship when they come to see you? And how do they find you?
Yeah, I guess there's a variety of ways, like word of mouth. Often people say like, hey, do you know a couples therapist? And luckily in our therapy center, we've got two couples therapists at the moment, and we're hoping to take on another person, or finding us online is another option. The stage that people come at in terms of the type of distress that they're experiencing in the relationship, that can vary from relationship to relationship. Some people, yeah, it is like the last attempt to see if they can make things work. And some people are coming for maintenance, or to do even better in their happiness because they're feeling really happy and connected, but they know that there's some issues there that they want to get some help. Creating a safe space, I guess, to be able to talk about topics such as gender, such as power, such as the household chores, even the division of labor, who does what within the home, and how that can cause conflict, child rearing, and differences of opinion. Having a third person, if it is a two-person relationship, having a third person there to create a safe space to explore with curiosity can provide a breathing room for people who get stuck into a cycle or a pattern of kind of dismissing each other, which again, in terms of like more significant levels of violence, and it's like so strange to put it on a scale, but I guess there is levels. Um, in private practice therapy, we don't tend to see a whole lot of people with significant domestic violence, because they are in a position where they want to somehow figure it out and create space. So it hasn't gone as chaotic as maybe, I guess, or maybe I'm wrong, Jensen, at Women in Crisis. I have referred people to Women in Crisis, where I've been working with one individual, and I was like, that, like, there's more, you need more support, and I can provide you in 1 hour a week. You need all the supports that Jensen mentioned around housing and financial support, and how to figure out like what is safe and how to do an exit strategy if that's what you decide to do as a person. So yeah, in private practice, we don't tend to maybe get as many people who are in deep domestic violence, but I view kind of like violence as being like I really like the work of non-violent communication styles, which is kind of like talking, which identifies any element of communication that can be viewed as taking power, or not being taking ownership of your own stuff, your own emotions. That's potentially a violent way of interacting with another human. So I kind of view violence from that perspective in terms of therapeutic, if you're not listening to somebody or creating space for them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So then, Jensen, you're seeing families in a very different light as opposed to Shane in his practice. They're sort of on the spectrum there. Okay.
Yeah, so we would see, and I also say this as not a counselor, but we see women who are experiencing or have experienced abuse, even in childhood. And so where we're coming from, we're letting them know about their options based on what they're looking for, helping them with safety planning, whether they want to stay in that relationship or not. But since we are like a feminist organization, we do work primarily with women and those who are experiencing abuse, rather than working kind of on that collaborative approach, as you're saying, with couples therapy, that it's both partners are involved. We really just see kind of the women who are experiencing different forms of abuse, and helping them cope, helping them heal with whatever they may need in their journey, rather than kind of that more collaborative, how can you folks work on this together? It's really just about supporting them from our organizational standpoint anyways. So I think that's maybe why you see more in like couples therapy and private practice, but not so much in the anti-gender-based violence sector counseling, is that it's more like survivor focused, I guess, in a way. And not to say that couples therapy can't be survivor centric, it's just that it's less collaborative in terms of working with both the abuser and the abused.
That sounds like a good way to put that, I think. Yeah. Less collaborative, perhaps. Yeah. But more collaborative for the family and more urgency in terms of resettlement. Right. Jensen, could you speak to the umbrella of the organization, Women in Crisis, and what are all the services that are offered? That would be amazing if you could educate our public on that.
Certainly. So yeah, we deal with both violence prevention, and so that's really my role, which is in public education and engagement. We also have a volunteer program that helps out with that work as well. So doing events such as Take Back the Night, which is about like those in the community, survivors, reclaiming their power. We do public engagement and awareness events such as like December 6th, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. So utilizing events and awareness to make it a constant conversation in the community and the public eye that anti-gender-based violence work is being done. We also do like services that support survivors in their healing journey. So we have our emergency shelter, which is Marianne's Place. We have a 24-hour crisis line that folks can access, and anyone can access that. So no matter how you identify, that information is kept confidential, and that provides connections to either our services, or if we, for some reason, aren't the agency to deal with it, referrals to other community agencies as well. And we do a lot of work collaboratively with other community agencies. So with local mental health organizations, with healthcare providers, with mental health and addictions, with social support such as Ontario Works, housing, local housing organizations. And we also have a transitional housing and support program, which can help with for women who are wanting to like resettle and transition their housing situation to being independent, living on their own or living with their children. As well, I mentioned the family court support program, which helps those navigate the family court system. So around custody and divorce, property, those types of things, and helping with that advocacy. And that's a huge part of it as well, is just advocating and helping women advocate for themselves. We also have a anti-human trafficking program, which deals mostly with survivors of sex trafficking, just with the nature of the work that we do. And that also provides counseling and practical assistance. We have a rural women support program, as I mentioned, that served Wellington County, and the Sexual Assault Center, which provides support specifically to those who have experienced sexual violence, and that's mostly counseling focused there. I believe that's everything. We do a lot.
Sorry, that's big time for sure. That's quite a list. At a grassroots level, how do people find out about you? So for example, I was having a conversation with someone about sex trade workers recently and the resources available to them. How would someone even discover Women in Crisis?
Sure. So like I mentioned, if you search kind of like gender-based violence organizations, or for those who are listening that are in Ontario, we have something called the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers. And so on their website, you can find, based on any community in Ontario, where your local organization is that supports survivors. And so there are kind of, I believe, hopefully more like provincial umbrellas there where folks can find access to services. In the community, you can find us on our website, which is gwwomenincrisis.org. On social media, our Instagram and Twitter is at GWWIC, as well through, if you're interested in resources, informations, trainings, and public education, you can reach out to me. My email is wiceducator@gwwomenincrisis.org. So you can reach out to us anytime for those interested in programming, in resources, if you're looking to know more. Yeah.
Yeah. And are you in the school system at all? Are you able to go into the classrooms and speak at different age levels? Have you been doing that, Jensen?
It has been challenging with the pandemic of being able to, as they're not taking guests in person, but that is something that we are like working on, is helping develop lesson plans, and any educational materials that's being delivered in school boards can be adapted to meet curriculum expectations as well. So that is definitely something that we're interested in exploring more, and have done in the past, because it's a really great and key way to work with other educators within the public school system who are doing that work. For sure.
Oh, that's awesome. That's really good. Shane, did you want to add anything right now?
No, yeah, I can just speak from my experience of having referred some people to Women in Crisis, and just the support that the women found from Women in Crisis was like so helpful and so beneficial to the work that they were doing in their own lives. That's the only piece I wanted to add.
Oh, that's incredible. So great. Shout out for sure. For sure. Jensen, is there a mentorship opportunity for anyone that's perhaps resettled, if you will, and they wanted to give back in some way, shape, or form, is there an opportunity to mentor another survivor?
We do have a volunteer program that at the moment is a little bit on hold just with COVID, and we don't have a ton to do with that. But definitely keep your eyes peeled. Follow us on our social media, as well as check our website, as when we'll be kind of relaunching that. It is a great way for folks to get involved and give back to the agency. So that is one way, but we're also hosting a lot of virtual events. So ways that people can get involved and start their education online. And that is, I will say, one benefit of the pandemic is that it's made education really widely accessible with it being in an online format, internet connection permitting. Um, that is one way that folks can get involved. And I think for like new Canadians as well, looking at what organizations are in the communities through immigrant services, local immigrant services chapters, we have a great connection with them. For folks who are maybe looking to get involved and interact with other new Canadians, and then sometimes we'll deliver sort of educational programming for those groups as well.
And that's great. That's awesome. About yourself, Shane, in your practice, any families able to mentor other couples, if you will, in that regard?
There is a workshop that it's called Hold Me Tight.
Yes.
It developed by the founder of Emotion Focused Couples Therapy that runs. I don't run it, but a colleague, my supervisor, runs that regularly. And couples and families, or well, many couples going to those events do find that being able to see that other couples are struggling too in their dynamics, and that there is, because I think there is this Pollyanna view often that everybody is doing really well or other relationships are going well, and this is just happening to me and in my dynamic and in my relationship, and therefore I'm bad or I'm wrong or I'm messed up. And that internalization, so going to like groups or talking to other couples or other friends or peers about like, hey, this is happening to me, because it's really quite more common than any of us imagine, between either mental health or abusive situations or small problems in relationships that need to be resolved that aren't spoken about. So yeah, I guess in terms of specific mentorship for my work in private practice, confidentiality is so important. You don't really connect people together. But I think in my mind in the future, I would love to definitely start like a men's group to start working on breaking down gender stereotypes and nonviolent communication informed men's group. Also, my colleague Jane Craft, she works a lot with women and new moms particularly, and I've offered in the past postpartum depression groups to support the mental health of moms, postpartum depression for men who struggle with the idea of like new families and how to navigate the stresses of life around that too. So yeah, there's potential there. I guess we're growing as a therapy center. Tristan Price and Jane Craft, who are Tristan's a registered marriage and family therapist, and Jane Craft, who's a social worker, are both excellent psychotherapists. And I think hopefully down the road we will start to offer more community-based services. We do offer sliding scale or reduced rate therapy to people too, to make it more accessible to people. Unfortunately, I guess the struggle, because my background is in community work, then I trained to be a psychotherapist, and then I found myself working in private practice now. The struggle is always trying to navigate the financial element of trying to pay our bills and provide support to people. Like, we get so many people who need sliding scale. We definitely can't support the amount of need that's there for people. So hopefully in the future, the Ontario government or the Canadian system would look more towards providing therapeutic supports for mental health to people, so that finances aren't such a barrier. I know there are definitely services available in the community. Certainly, though, from the amount of calls that we get for people looking for low cost, it's definitely a something that needs to be addressed more on a government level, to provide therapeutic supports for people at lower cost.
That's great. Thank you. For any of our viewers out there, in terms of education, how can we instill in the fact that how would someone know their rights, for example? How could they go about educating themselves, educating their family or their friends? Well, they may not know the rights that they have.
Yeah.
As a youth, right? Just figuring it all out.
That's a good question. I would say, the internet is your friend. It is, as I'm saying, making that information more widely available. And for some of these websites like ours, for example, you can hide your visits to that website if it's not safe for you to be on those. And to seek out that information at home. And then, yeah, if you're in doubt of what your rights are and you need information, give your local gender-based violence organization a call, give your legal aid organization in your community a call to kind of, depending on the types of rights you're looking to find. Yeah, I would say just utilize any resources that can be made available to you and utilize organizations and information that will support survivors. So those types of resources.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to add, for me as a therapist, one resource that I give out to people sometimes, that it's called the Wheel of Power and Control. And it lists kind of ways in which abuse or coercion of power can happen. I can't remember all of the ones, but that can be an eye-opening one for people to be like, oh, if somebody's telling you how you can or cannot dress, or what you can or cannot say to somebody, or like controlling your money, or controlling your friendships with other people, controlling your basic freedoms. To be able to like dive deeper in, and there's like questionnaires, and as Jensen said, I guess online there's so many resources around like what are my rights, what am I entitled to.
That's good. And in terms of your work for couples, how do you create that safe space for couples? For example, maybe they're not able to attend a therapy session, for example, but you wanted to help them, empower them as in their relationship, but they wanted to create boundaries for themselves. How would one go about doing that? They don't have the resources to come and see a therapist.
Yeah, if somebody doesn't have the resources, I guess there is low cost options or sliding scale options available in the community, like the Guelph Child and Family Center at the University of Guelph. They offer reduced rate therapy to families and couples and individuals. And then there's the Guelph Wellington Counselling and Family Services. They are also they're government funded as well. If it was, I guess emailing out some resources again, like John Gottman, John and Julia Gottman, or couples therapists that have kind of like skills work for people to navigate through conflictual situations, and some really good website, the Gottman Institute website, that has like lots of resources as well on it. Again, just we also offer individual therapy. I guess I know we're focusing on the couples part, but a good chunk of our work, more than 50%, I'd say, is working with individuals as well. And a lot of the work does need to be done individually with people, because it's not necessarily survivors' work to be done when there's conflict in the dynamic of the couple. So oftentimes I would break them in. If it's a couple, would do individual work with the perpetrator or the more abusive partner, to kind of start to broaden their understanding of power dynamics, and educate a little bit more around ways to tolerate their own distress, because oftentimes perpetrators get so distressed they only act out of violence from that level of distress in their bodies, and they start to feel like victims. So kind of working on education around that, and understanding where that comes from within them, and providing a space for them to actually start seeing different ways of behaving, so that they don't continue to perpetrate violence. That definitely often, like as Jensen was saying, in Women in Crisis, they work solely with the survivors. Again, if you're working with a perpetrator, you wouldn't probably, you definitely wouldn't have them doing a big chunk of work on their changing their behavior with the person who's the survivor of the abuse in the same session. You would break that up. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
No, that's a very good point. I'm glad that you shared that. And it's speaking to breaking it down, and at the very beginning of, even in the beginning of life, really. So it has to start there. So I understand that we have to break it down. I wondered if we could if we have a few more moments just to speak to our viewers in terms of a call to action and raising awareness in the work that you both do. And I'll just jump over to Jensen for a moment. And Jensen, what would be a call to action for our youth or any viewers out there to, how could they help in something like this in raising awareness? They may feel powerless themselves and not really sure what to do or even how to go about raising awareness.
No, that's a great question. I would say to just practice and model respectful, nonviolent behavior, healthy problem solving within your relationships. I mentioned earlier, normalizing conversations around consent and healthy relationships, being critical too of what you see in the media around relationships, because I find sometimes they'll normalize, obsession and possessiveness as being something that's romantic. And a good example of this, there's a Netflix show called You, which is about a stalking relationship that's really romanticized, and a lot of young people watched it and loved it. And so I think it's really to see those things exemplified and to be critical of them is really important. To educate yourself and others about dating violence, and not letting it go unrecognized as well. So when you see it, understanding what it is and naming it. For supporting survivors, listening and believing them, providing non-judgmental support and options, holding abusers accountable for their abusive behaviors if it's safe to do so. So when you see, examples in the media of celebrities who are being abusive, sharing that information, because I think that information is part of naming it, and letting it be recognized as being a problem in society. To speak out against victim blaming, myths about dating and domestic violence. I know you touched on this, Shane, but challenging gender roles that normalize violence. So speaking out against sexist, homophobic, racist jokes and behaviors, helping to work towards creating more safe and inclusive spaces for everyone, and to really challenge oppression in all of its forms. Another thing is if you as an individual wants to do something, wants to do more, figure out what your school is doing to prevent dating abuse, what kind of education is available, start a group with your friends of consent on campus if you're someone who's working or attending a school right now. Attending online events that talk about gender-based violence, consent, healthy relationships, seeking out that information, I would say, whenever you can.
Wow, I love that. Beautifully. Shane?
That's such a great list, Jensen. I'm super impressed. That's amazing. You can really see the educator experience there. So many wonderful things. Everything you said, and I guess the idea of kind of, I guess, trusting your own instinct as well. I think you mentioned that as well. The idea of if something feels wrong in your body, if it feels like this isn't right or healthy, it feels kind of abusive, or it feels like just microaggressions and they're not safe. Trusting that that's true and believing that you have the wisdom to know what feels good. The body gives the signals very often, what is right and nice and safe and good, and what's not right, nice, good, and safe. Kind of trusting that instinct or that gut instinct, or that inner voice that might kind of say no, this is not fair, this is not good, this is not right. And then, talking to friends, community members that are, you're not in it alone. It's such a important thing for mental health to be able to know that there are other community members in your particular community that are struggling with this, and to be able to connect with them through either Women in Crisis or through online groups or spaces that are safe. And as you said, attending those spaces, Jensen, and connecting with them and networking, and the importance of community, I guess, and talking, and then not being afraid to organize, if that particular community or group doesn't exist, to begin to connect with the idea of this is true and this is real, so therefore maybe I could organize or I could form this group or this community in my school or in my college, as you said, Jensen. See what's there and see what gaps might be missing.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Shane and Jensen. Shane, if someone wants to get a hold of you, how could they reach out to you or Spacious Mind?
Yeah, the best way is probably to go to our website, spaciousmindcounseling.com. We've a contact form there, or they can email us or me personally at Shane, S-H-A-N-E, at spaciousmindcounseling.com. And it's spacious mind, singular, counseling.com.
Awesome. And we've shared your handles there, Jensen. So is there anything you wanted to say, closing remarks before we say goodbye to our viewers and listeners? Oh, good.
I really enjoyed chatting with you both. It was really nice to meet you both. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you for having me. This was a great way to spend my afternoon.
Oh, that's fantastic. Myself as well. To our viewers, you have been watching Youth for Change, and I have just been really thrilled to speak with Jensen Williams, who's a public educator for women and Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis, and Shane Smith, who works for Spacious Minds. We've been talking about domestic violence, raising awareness, and family dynamics as well. Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for sharing with us today. I look forward to chatting with you again. Youth for Change. I'm your host, Lynn McEntee. We're all about stepping outside the box. See you next time.